The notion of the 1688 revolution being a glorious revolution wasn't universally held, and some did in fact want a war, particularly many of the powerful Highland clans. Immediately after the revolution in 1689, James would return with an army in an attempt to retake the throne, and groups of Highlanders, led by the Viscount Dundee, Ewan Cameron of Lochiel, Alexander Cannon, and Thomas Buchanan, would fight for King James in what would become known as the First Jacobite Rising. The Jacobites, those loyal to King James, were largely defeated, and the Scottish Secretary of State, the Earl of Stair, offered to pay the clans sizable amounts in exchange for their support of King William. Defeated, ultimately King James would suggest to the Highland clan chiefs that they take the deal. The Rising would not truly end until 1692, when troops of the Earl of Argyll's regiment, under the command of Robert Campbell of Glenlyon, would take refuge in the homes of the MacDonald clan. Invited in as guests, the troops would block off escapes from the glen, and those within the homes, during the freezing night, were ordered to kill all of the clan. This would become known as the Glencoe Massacre, and would lead to substantial uproar. Yet despite all this, William of Orange was securely on the throne, though Jacobitism would continue to grow within Britain. In 1715, when it became clear that the throne would pass even further away from the Stuarts to a distant cousin, the Elector of Hanover, the Jacobites rose once more in an attempt to place James's son, James Francis Edward Stuart, on the throne. Ordinarily, he would have been next in line for the throne, but shortly before the death of King William, Catholics had become officially and legally barred from holding the throne. In northern Scotland, above the Firth of Forth, the Jacobites were much more successful this time. There was also Jacobite support in England, with some MPs and lords joining the cause, and the Dutch sent troops to support the Hanoverian, indebting King George to the Dutch, and causing him to back the Dutch in internal Holy Roman imperial politics in the implementation of the Barrier, a treaty granting the Dutch access to buffer territory to garrison troops between the Dutch Republic and France in Habsburg-held lands. After the defeat of the 1715 Rising, there would be yet another in 1719. Yet all would seem lost. The British throne was now securely held by the Hanoverians. However, in 1745, when the British military was distracted by the War of Austrian Succession, a conflict which had arisen when Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV issued the Pragmatic Sanction, ensuring that all of his territory could be inherited by his daughter, Maria Theresa. The British, Dutch, Hanoverians, and Russians fought on one side, supporting Maria Theresa, while the French, Prussians, Spaniards, Bavarians, Genoese, Swedes, and Modenians fought on the other, with the Saxons, Polish-Lithuanians, and Sardinians fighting on both sides at different times. Here we can see a very clear example of Britain, the Dutch Republic, and Hanover acting as one closely aligned entity at this time. By this point, James Francis Edward Stuart had grown older and had a son, Charles Edward Stuart, who would be known to Jacobites as Bonnie Prince Charlie. And with the support of the Spanish and French kings, he planned to retake the throne for the Stuart family. And after months of planning, Bonnie Prince Charlie successfully captured Glenfinnan, and by September of that year, Prince Charlie's forces entered Edinburgh to no resistance. The government's forces amassed and were led by General Sir John Cope. Cope sent a challenge frae Dunbar, saying, "Charlie, meet me in your door, and I'll learn ye the art of war if you meet me in the morning." The lyrics to the Jacobite song Johnny Cope ring out as on September 21st, in the Battle of Preston Pans, or Gladsmuir, the Jacobites scattered Cope's army in under 20 minutes. The Jacobites seemed to have enormous momentum, and perhaps there would be another Stuart king. Through the next year, the Jacobites gained momentum and moved into England. However, uncertainty surrounding French support began to hurt morale and build suspicion, and as time went on, some of their earlier momentum began to dwindle. In April 1746, the government forces scored a decisive victory in the Battle of Culloden, leaving the Jacobites badly damaged and disorganized. Prince Charlie would return to France, saying that he would return with reinforcements. Yet the rising would ultimately fail to materialize. The government forces would then go to search for remaining rebels, and in 1747 beheaded some of the Jacobite lords, though most prisoners were released in 1746 under the General Pardon Act. Jacobitism would remain, and Charlie would make future attempts to revive the endeavor, but after the defeat, it would begin dwindling substantially, becoming almost non-existent in England. Charlie's future attempts to retake the throne were substantially weaker, and ultimately, recognized as king by the Pope, he would move to live in Rome, where the church gave him the Palazzo Muti as his home. He would spend the rest of his days in Italy, mainly in Rome, and would have a rather sad life. He became a depressed alcoholic, and on January 30th of 1788, at 67 years old, he died of a stroke. The defeat of the Jacobite cause and Prince Charlie's inability to mount another attempt firmly entrenched the Hanoverian kings on the British throne. The Hanoverian kings had become indebted to the Dutch Republic and Britain to Dutch financiers. The Hanoverian kings often showed more interest in Hanover than in Great Britain. With the Stuarts now truly defeated, and no other notable attempts to retake the throne, Britain was no longer under British control. It was now truly bound to the continent, with a German elector on its throne, and indebtedness to Amsterdam. The defeat of the 1745 Jacobite Rising was the defeat of the last attempt to keep Britain the separate island that it was. On the death of Queen Anne, Catholics being barred from holding the throne, the crown ultimately passed to her nearest Protestant relative, who would be George of Hanover. He was the son of Ernst Augustus, the Elector of Hanover, and Sophia of the Palatinate. Toward the end of Queen Anne's life, it was presumed that Princess Sophia would become the next British queen. Yet following her death, the young George became the presumptive heir, as both British monarch and as Prince Elector in the Holy Roman Empire. The House of Hanover was formed as a cadet branch of the House of Welf, founded in the 11th century by Duke Welf I of Bavaria, who himself was the son of the Margrave of Milan. The family can trace its origins back to Lombardy. The family would go on to hold Tuscany, Carinthia, Altdorf, Brunswick, the Palatinate of the Rhine, Lüneburg, Spoleto, Saxony, Burgundy, and the Holy Roman Empire itself. The family held enormous significance in the Holy Roman Empire, with prince-electors being the highest rulers of the empire, aside from the emperor himself. Early into his reign, King George faced the Jacobite Rising, which he ultimately defeated. He was highly active in continental politics and Britain's foreign politics. Joining Austria, France, Savoy, and the Dutch Republic in the War of the Quadruple Alliance, attempting to diminish the Spanish Empire's power on the continent. By this point, the multiple crowns of Great Britain held by the monarch had become unified into one, making its wearer the King of Great Britain. While he ruled absolute in Hanover, he would have to negotiate with Parliament in Britain, and the power of ministers was growing substantial, including the Whig politician Robert Walpole, the first Earl of Oxford, who would consolidate enormous political power, holding titles such as the First Lord of the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Leader of the House of Commons, and in retrospect, he would be considered to be Britain's first Prime Minister. The Whigs attempted policies to limit the power of the nobility, including the introduction of the 1719 Peerage Bill, designed to limit the size of the House of Lords, ultimately increasing the power of the House of Commons. Though the act ultimately failed, this was part of a larger series of attempts to reduce the power of the nobility. The rising financial class had begun to exert itself more and more politically, seeing the nobility with their warrior tradition as a threat to this expansion of power. The traditional nobility had grown out of a warrior tradition, with their first responsibility to fight for the kingdom and people. They held enormous influence and large resources, including substantial territory and properties. The new financial class that was gaining extraordinary power, and the politicians of the commons, would be limited in their ability to remake Great Britain and secure power for themselves, so long as the nobility remained substantial. Through this period, we can see politicians and financiers alike, who quite often had substantial overlap, attempting to destroy Great Britain's nobility, to have their powers reduced by law, indebt them to the financial financial class, bankrupt them, and acquire their properties. This was the usurpation of the old aristocracy by the new financial aristocracy. And while the old were bound to the land, legacy, tradition, heritage, and duty, the new were not. The new had no such ties, except perhaps to money, the city of London, and Amsterdam. And as ministers and financiers rose while the nobility fell, Great Britain began to resemble the Dutch Republic increasingly more. All the while, the British Empire was expanding rapidly and was becoming an enormously powerful hub of commerce and finance. During this great expansion, however, the British state had become increasingly dependent on debt financing and was particularly indebted to the Bank of England, a private bank chartered in 1694. Its earliest owners were noblemen, merchants, and financiers. Some of these notable owners were King William and Queen Mary themselves. Sir John Houblon, who was the bank's first governor. Born in 1632, Sir John Houblon was a London merchant and member of the Portugal Merchants Group, a group of British merchants who traded heavily with the Portuguese. His father was James Houblon, a prominent London merchant with Dutch and French ancestry. His mother was Mary Duquesne, daughter of another prominent London merchant, Jean Duquesne. The family were Huguenots with ties to Flanders. Sir John was one of the earliest and largest investors in the Bank of England. He was sheriff, alderman, and Lord Mayor of the City of London, the independent, beating heart of British finance. His prominence was substantial, and certain issues of British banknotes placed him on the £50 note. Other major investors would be Mordecai Abbott, Joseph Ongar, the Portuguese Merchants Group, and Lord Sir Gilbert Heathcote, another Lord Mayor of the City of London, and Whig politician who would go on to be governor of the bank. It is estimated that between 10 and 20% of Bank of England shares were held by Dutch investors directly, and a major fraction beyond that were held by British merchants, financiers, and institutions with heavy ties to Amsterdam. The Bank of England had attained a monopoly on the financing of British state debt. The War of Spanish Succession and the Great Northern War had left Britain with a very large debt load, and a highly chaotic one. Each of Britain's debts were written separately, with different interest rates and covenants attached to the different issues. This left Parliament looking for a way to consolidate and organize the debt. A debt of around £9 million. When compared to personal incomes of the time, that would be equivalent to around £9 billion today, although direct comparisons across this much time are very difficult. The enormous success of trade companies like the British East India Company or the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company gave Parliament an idea. They would call all of their outstanding debt and issue shares in a new company, the South Sea Company. The company would then be paid £568,297 each year, which would then be paid out to shareholders as dividends, earning them 6%. This would thereby consolidate all the debts, and as a sweetener for this debt equity swap, the South Sea Company would be granted a monopoly over trade in South America, creating the opportunity for equity upside, and the public would show enormous interest. Nearly 150 years prior, in 1571, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the Royal Exchange had been set up, creating a place for people to trade stocks. Originally, only 100 brokers were licensed to trade in the Royal Exchange, and they could not own or trade the shares that they acquired for clients. This gave rise to a new profession: stock jobbers, who would buy and sell securities for their clients and trade in them themselves. In this, they began to act as market makers. The stock jobbers were banned from the Royal Exchange and began to trade in the streets and establishments nearby. This area, close to the Bank of England, would become known as Exchange Alley. By 1719, in the reign of King George, this financial network had become much more extensive, and the public were extremely interested in the South Sea Company. At the beginning of 1719, South Sea Company shares were trading a little over £100. By April, they traded at £350, 600 by the end of May, 950 in June, and at its peak in 1720, £1,050. Investors, traders, and stock jobbers alike created enormous fortunes on South Sea Company shares. The mania for these shares was extraordinary. Many notable figures got involved, like Sir Isaac Newton. His timing, however, like many others, was unfortunate, as he would lose over £10,000 investing in the company, as the company's share price would collapse down to £190 rapidly within the same year. Many investors caught up in the mania, who thought that this would be their ticket to great wealth, found themselves crushed when the share price collapsed. Much of the financial math that is used today had not yet been developed, but an early technique was to treat the company as income-producing land and attempt to value the income and dividends of the companies as if they were rents. Many more level-headed investors quickly realized that the price of the South Sea Company was wildly disproportionate to its economic value. Though this would certainly not be the last bubble in Great Britain, it did show the beginning of more systematic and calculating forms of finance, and the Britain of the Georgian kings would prove to be one of the most rapid periods of financialization. Upon the death of King George I, he was succeeded by his son, George II. George was thoughtful and learned since a young age. He spoke French, German, English, and Italian, with a particular interest in military history and tactics, something which would show up frequently in his life. He often fought with his father, perhaps owing in part to his popularity, something his father as king was skeptical of. As heir apparent and Prince of Wales, he frequently showed opposition to his father's policies, and as king, he demonstrated an opposition to the powerful Whig politician, Sir Robert Walpole. Yet Walpole's power in Parliament was too substantial, and the king had no choice but to retain him. He frequently spent time in Hanover, and dedicated much of his energy to Holy Roman Imperial politics, which began to draw the ire of the British people. He continued policies of opposing Spain's rise, going to war with Spain in 1739 in the War of Jenkins' Ear. He would involve himself again with the Holy Roman Empire in the War of Austrian Succession, when he would fight alongside the French and the Dutch to back Maria Theresa's claim as the successor of Charles IV and heiress of the Habsburgs Empire. Much of his reign would be devoted to war, including putting down the 1745 Jacobite Rising. He was primarily engaged in external politics, often focused around Hanoverian interests, and remaining very close with the Dutch. His daughter Anne would marry William IV of Orange, forging a direct dynastic tie with the Orange princes. All the while, the power of Parliament grew and the lords receded. The life of King George III is a very sad tale. Unlike his father and grandfather, he was very committed to showing that he was a British king and not a German, and he showed a genuine care for Britain. Like his father and grandfather, Parliament, the merchant and financial classes expanded their power under his reign, with him giving up crown lands to the Parliament immediately upon his ascension. Yet, unlike his father and grandfather, he demonstrated a strong backing of the Tories. He was crowned in 1760, directly in the heart of the 7 Years' War. The war largely began as a dispute between Britain and France regarding North American territories, but quickly became another European balance of power conflict, pitting Great Britain, Prussia, and Portugal against France, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and Sweden. As the war expanded, however, the coalitions would come to encompass many more European nations, as well as others from around the world. He committed much of his wealth to charity, and was an enormous patron of the arts. He fought frequently with George Grenville, the Whig Prime Minister, who continued the work of attempting to reduce the king's power, and that of the nobles. After a decade of his reign, the 1770s increasingly began to be marked by political dispute in the North American colonies. Figures like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton felt that the king had betrayed the constitutional principles of the Glorious Revolution, allowing for Parliament to turn tyrannical and overreach, stifling and abusing the colonies, while Benjamin Franklin directed his ire to the king's ministers. Still, others more radical, like Thomas Jefferson, took a more Lockean, social contract view, and believed that the colonists should be free of Parliament and the king. Generally, all of these figures believed that the rights of Englishmen had not been properly extended to the colonists. Ultimately, the colonists would revolt, succeed, and become free of Great Britain. While it is commonly known that the colonists received military support from the French, one thing which is less known is how much of the revolution was financed by Dutch bankers. By this point, Anglo-Dutch relations had begun to cool. Much of the political and financial establishments of Great Britain were formed by Dutch financiers and those brought into their sphere. Many wealthy prominent figures in Great Britain had come over directly from the Netherlands during the Glorious Revolution. Figures like William Bentinck, the first Earl of Portland, and Arnold van Keppel, the first Earl of Albemarle, were given these positions directly by King William. Other families like the Hoblons, who came from fleeing Huguenots and achieved great prominence in British finance, can trace Dutch origins. Other families like the Barenbergs, who started Barenberg Bank, had either moved to Great Britain or had established substantial financial influence in the kingdom, so it should seem strange that Dutch and British relations would now cool, yet the prominent families had already established substantial control over the empire, and in North America, it was perhaps even deeper. Though the colony of New Netherlands had been ceded to Great Britain, its trade networks were still largely dominated by the Dutch. The patroon system allowed Dutch settlers to the North American continent to establish powerful land-holding positions, functionally making them nobility in New York. New Netherlands itself was found by merchants of the Ochtaierdische West-Indische Company. Many of these early Dutch merchant and financial families would become the most powerful families of New York, and in fact the United States. Families like the Van Rensselaers, who were originally patroons in New Netherlands, or the Scholars, the descendant of which would become General Schuyler, the American Revolutionary military leader who fought in the Saratoga campaign against General Burgoyne. There are now many places named for the family in the United States. They would intermarry with the Livingstons and Van Cortlandts. They are also ancestors of the Bush family, and there are many others. Other families would be the Beekmans, the Van Burens, and the Roosevelts, to name a few of the most notable. So the presence of the Dutch financial class and financial families was already substantial in North America. A loss of the North American continent for the British would mean very little to these families. In fact, it would be quite a benefit. While these families already had substantial control in Great Britain, they would be able to be the creditors, owners, and founding members of a new nation, all while maintaining substantial influence over the British Empire. These families were no longer bound to Amsterdam, but had truly become a global class, with familial ties, business ties, and chains of loyalty stretching across nations. New families outside of the Netherlands would join their ranks and become an empire amongst empires. Networks of financial families who held substantial power on the continent, in the British Empire, and now the United States. A network of families who owned the world. After the American Revolution, King George continued political conflicts at home. A notable exertion of his political influence was the appointment of Pitt the Younger as Prime Minister, which caused much uproar in the House of Commons by those who believed that the king had overstepped his bounds by exerting influence to have a Prime Minister appointed. He continued to support the Tory MP and draw Whig ire. Pitt the Younger would implement many financial reforms in Great Britain, including changes to trade policy, making it easier to trade goods that were being frequently smuggled by merchants. He instituted an income tax in an effort to pay off the mounting national debt, which had once again ballooned from Britain's many wars. He suspended the conversion of banknotes into gold, and internationally, he begins to show an early sign of Britain's fear of Russian power, concerned by how large and dominant the empire was becoming. This would become a long-standing foreign policy interest of Great Britain for centuries to come. Yet his concerns in the East were pushed down to a lower priority, as two threats to monarchy converged at once. In the late 1780s, the French Revolution had begun, alarming monarchists all across Europe. While the North American colonies had become a republic, it wasn't ultimately a republican revolution. However, the violent events in France proved to be something entirely different, with the execution of King Louis XVI at the hands of the revolutionaries. Much of the liberal philosophy which had been spreading in Europe at this time had been perpetuated by financial class-owned institutions, and by members of this rising middle class. If you look at the ranks of who were in the French Revolution, it's really quite stunning how many were lawyers. Yet the financial middle class's assault on the monarchy had never been this dire, nor this imminent. This was no longer a slow chipping away at Europe's nobility, but a decapitation. And at the same time, back in Britain, the king began to show signs of some strange mental deterioration, a problem which would continue to deteriorate for the rest of his life. George would increasingly spend time with the support of doctors, eventually becoming unable to fulfill his functions as monarch, and thus a regency was put in place, with his son, George, Prince of Wales, acting as regent. The British people largely thought of him as frivolous and decadent, and he faced strong opposition from Parliament. Yet, both as regent and later as king, he would rise to face serious challenges, as the violence-torn France would re-emerge as a new empire, and at the head of it, l'Empereur.